Hello Internet, my name is the Golden Stalfos, and today we're doing part three of our, no, four, yeah, sorry, of our dissection into the differences between the Souls games, as they're collectively referred to. Today we're going to be talking about Bloodborne, because it is the fourth released in chronological order. Now again, just for clarification, I don't think Bloodborne or Demon's Souls should be counted in the same series as Dark Souls for a variety of reasons, but they are frequently lumped together because they share the core gameplay loop. But there's so many variations on that loop that I don't think it's fair to lump them in together. And honestly, if you play Bloodborne, I think that becomes very apparent because this is the game that kind of solidifies all the things you didn't want to have in the previous games, or all the things I didn't want to have, and kind of accelerates them. So, what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, balance is something that FromSoft has struggled with throughout this set of games, but it really comes to a head in Bloodborne. You know, in other games, there were a variety of different play options, but one or two of those options were intrinsically better than others because they were easier and did more damage. But in Bloodborne, those options just flat out don't exist. Right? Like, if you play Demon's Souls or Dark Souls, yeah, spells are overpowered compared to everything else, but you can still play the game without magic if you want, and some people take great pride in doing that for some reason. I don't know why. But I mean, even besides that, you could play with archery or heavy armor or shields or a variety of different kinds of melee weapons. You could use huge fuck off hammers and tiny little backstabby daggers and everything in between, swords, maces, axes, and in Bloodborne, you can waste a lot of time and energy on shit weapons, or you can pick up the sock lever and stop wasting everyone's fucking time. I mean, it's just like inherently the best option, hands down. There's nothing else that's even kind of as good, and that includes the DLC weapons. And on top of that, there's way lower weapon variety. Spells are not a thing that you can use exclusively. I mean, for one thing, you don't get access to any spells until like way deep into the game. And for another thing, there's only like 6 or so spells in the entire game. There's not very many. And they all kind of suck damage wise. Like, they're just not that impressive compared to what you can do in the Souls games. There is no heavy armor. There's, I think, 2 shields in the entire game, both of which are complete shit, and they make sure to let you know it. The entire control scheme has been changed so that you can't even really block with a shield if that's what you wanted to do. There is no archery. I mean, you do have guns, but you can't really aim with them. They're just there to parry with, and they don't really do very much damage. I mean, there is a way to get some damage out of some guns, like specifically the cannon, but also that uses up like literally all of your shots in one go, so whatever. Um, you know, basically, if you play through Bloodborne, you're gonna be playing the exact same way as everyone else because there's not a whole lot of variety at hand. And what little variety is there is just inherently, you know, outclassed by the obvious best choice, which is your starting weapon. It's not even hard to get to. And, in Demon Souls, the obvious best weapon in the game does exist, but it's the pure blood sword, which you can't get until you've completed 2 different archstones and, you know, gotten a very specific item and gone to a vendor and upgraded. So it's kind of a pain in the ass to get in the first place. And then it scales on like 6 different stats, so you have to spread yourself thin and you know. I mean, none of that matters if you dupe souls, but if you're not doing that, it can be kind of a pain in the ass actually. In Dark Souls 1, there isn't necessarily a best weapon. I mean, there are best weapons in certain categories, right? Like, if you want a weapon that does, fast slashing damage, or, scales with dex rather, the Uchi-Katana is probably your best option, but some people will say the Gold Tracer is a better option. They're, pros and cons. Um, if you're going for great swords, there are several good options. From Moonlight, if you, have some points in Int, which, if you're going for great swords, is a weird choice, but eh. Um, over to like the actual great sword as it's named. There's the Zweihander. I mean, there's a lot of great weapons. There's all the Black Knight weapons are great. Um, so while yes, there are shit weapons, like no one is going to go through the entire game with the broken sword handle, or but there are lots of different options for a weapon that is definitely good enough to get you through the game and is definitely worth using, and honestly, I think that's even more true in Dark Souls 2, where they've expanded spell casting. So now you have miracles, spells, pyromancies, and hexes. And all of these things, have different stat requirements, and none of them are like super overpowered. And you can do a lot of interesting things within each area. So, I've built several different characters that just specialize in one kind of magic, and I've found that there isn't really a best magic to use. And kind of the same thing with the weapons. Like if you're going for strength, you can use the great clubs. Those are pretty good. Or you can take, some ultra great sword that has a secondary scaling, like the smelter sword. There are tons of boss weapons because there are tons of bosses, and not all of the boss weapons are good. And depending on your build, some of them are going to be like default the best boss weapon to get. Like, if you are doing a dex build, you want to kill the Flexile Sentry so you can get his sword. Because that's basically one of the best dex weapons in the game. But, again, there are still several other good options, and, but in Bloodborne, that's not even the case. I mean, in Bloodborne, there's a grand total of less than 20 weapons. I don't know what the actual number is because I am not a wiki. I could go look it up, but none of them matter because none of them are as good as the Saw Cleaver. Um, yeah, it's just kind of ridiculous. And I also think that New Game Plus is worse in Bloodborne than it is in a lot of other games. In Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, New Game Plus is just a way to torture yourself. Like, there's nothing new added. They just increase the challenge of the enemies by, giving them more health. But the amount of increase is a percentage, and the percentage gets smaller every time you New Game Plus, up until like +7, and then it just stays at that level. But again, there's no real reason to do that. It's just masochism at that point. In Dark Souls 2, there's a huge incentive, right? There are tons of items that are exclusive to New Game Plus. There are better versions of rings, better versions of, your soul drops, all kinds of unique things to find in New Game Plus, and you continue to gain levels at a pretty steady rate, so you can, be a strength build at the beginning of the game, but then by the time you're halfway through New Game Plus, you've gone to quality, and now you've got tons of extra levels, so you might as well, build some spell casting so you can buff your weapon a little bit, and, and especially when you're playing with friends, it's really good to go through all those extra areas. And again, because of bonfire aesthetics, you can manually choose to increase the difficulty of an area and get the new shit that's in that area. And you can even farm things that way by, things that would normally only appear once per playthrough. Certain treasure chests will reset when you ascetic, whatever the fuck it's, however you pronounce it. But others won't, so be careful about that. But yeah, and sometimes they'll add like red phantoms and things in New Game Plus. So it's a very worthwhile experience to go through, at least to New Game Plus 1 or 2, However, in Bloodborne, this is not the case at all. In Bloodborne, not only does your weapon do they not add anything interesting in New Game Plus, but they also make it so that the enemies are significantly harder than they were before in terms of the number of hits it takes to kill them. So in my most recent playthrough, I went through the entire game, a full set of chalice dungeons. I didn't farm every single chalice ever, but I went through each of the different areas that I could find a chalice for, and I made a chalice in each of the headstones, and I made a harder one each time. And then I also did the DLC. And, by the end of it, I'd more or less maxed out my damage. I had 50 on the 2 stats that affect scaling for the saw cleaver. And I had, a bunch of blood gems that do plus 18% physical damage on my weapon. I know there are slightly better blood gems that can be gotten if you farm the chalice dungeons extensively, but I didn't want to farm them extensively. I just wanted to see what they were made of, and then I started New Game Plus after getting the good ending, beating the secret boss and everything. And when I started going through the opening area, I was doing as much damage to the beginning enemies as I would have been in the original game with an unupgraded weapon. And as I went through, I just kept feeling like, wait a minute. If the enemy is in this area, now take, 8 hits to kill, then how annoying is it going to be to fight the enemies at the end of the game that took multiple attacks from a fully upgraded weapon? Like, am I just going to hate this game because of that? I'm just going to scale it up so much that those enemies are just untouchable. And I didn't actually get very far into the DLC before I realized that, yes, some enemies are just going to be stupidly untouchable in New Game Plus. Did I say very far into the DLC? That sounds like that's what I said. That's not what I meant to say. I got about 2 or 3 hours into New Game Plus before I realized that, yeah, no, the damage scaling is insane. Like, my weapon is basically maxed out, barring some better blood gems that I'd have to farm for in randomly generated dungeons. And even with that, I'm doing pretty shit damage to high level enemies. So, GG, I guess. And then I stopped playing that and switched over to playing another round of Demon's Souls because I like replayability. Even if I do sometimes end up turning into the same build at the end. So yeah, despite the aesthetic of Bloodborne being very cool, it has a really terrible gameplay loop in terms of replayability and diversity, which are two very big strengths of the rest of the games in the series. So yeah. Now, I don't think that makes it so that you shouldn't play the game or that the game is not good because of those things. It's just worth noting that those things definitely detract from the experience when compared to the other games in the series. Maybe for you, the atmosphere and whatnot make up for it, but all the games have pretty good atmosphere and visuals overall. I will say in Bloodborne, it's more important than ever to learn how to parry. However, the parry system sucks. Okay, so here's the thing. First of all, in order to parry an enemy attack, you have to shoot them with your gun mid-attack. Now, the problem with this is that the bullet takes time to travel to the enemy in real time as an actual projectile. So when you fire, it's possible for an attack to hit you and then get parried, and then you're knocked on the ground and you can't take advantage of your post. In fact, it's possible for an attack to be parried and then deal damage to you after the parry has happened, which is really shitty. And, again, because you're basically just staggering an enemy long enough to do a special attack on them, if you are knocked to the ground by an attack, then you don't get to do that special attack on them. And, even worse than that, if if you walk up to the enemy after doing the parry from a slightly wrong angle, you won't do the special attack. You'll just do a regular attack and knock them out of that prone state where they're vulnerable to the special attack, which also sucks, And this wasn't really a risk in the previous games because you parried with your shield, so you were, within striking range no matter what. Now, typically you are still within striking range when you parry in Bloodborne, but that's not as much of a given. And again, your angle can be off such that when you do go in for the hit, you don't get the riposte, you just get a regular attack. And it's very frustrating when that happens. And it's very frustrating when that happens, you know, after you got hit by the attack that you were parrying, and then it doesn't even give you the riposte, even though you parried them and knocked them into the prone state. It's very, very cool. So, yeah. However, there are some enemies where parrying is almost mandatory because it just is the only way to deal good damage. Like, for example, Orphan of Cause, the final boss of the DLC, was insanely difficult to kill, even with my very high damage setup, like I described it before. And, you know, honestly, I felt like even a parry attack did less damage than a single hit should have compared to what my attacks had been doing to the other bosses in the DLCs. And, you know, obviously I did eventually beat him, and it's actually kind of funny because I'd been struggling to beat him for an hour or two, and then I gave up. And I came back like 2 days later. I sat down with it and I played it just to show my friend, because he hadn't played the DLC, to show him how much of a pain in the ass this fight was. And then during that, I beat him in that first attempt of the day there. And I was like, well, what the fuck was that? Because previously I'd barely been able to get to phase 2 before I just get mashed into the ground. And then, all of a sudden I just went through it without even realizing I was going through it. So that was interesting. But yeah, parrying is almost essential on certain enemies like Orphan of Cause because it deals so much more damage than a regular attack. And, but then at the same time, there are still many enemies in the game who are not parryable because, and there's a limited number of parries you can have because it relies on your bullets, which you have a limited number of in your, inventory that's on your person. I don't know why the limit is so small on that. It's only 20, which, if you expect people to go around and parry basically every enemy they fight, 20 isn't enough, But, yeah, I don't know. It's weird. So, also, Bloodborne is much more obtuse when it comes to the function of its items compared to anything else. So at one point, I was going through my inventory and I saw an item that looked kind of interesting and it had a super vague description. And I was like, okay, what the fuck is this item? And then I clicked into an extended description and it was even more vague and even more useless. And I was just like, hold on, what the fuck does this item even do? As it happens, it was just a covenant item, and you smash it to gain loyalty in your covenant. But the item didn't say that. I had to go to a wiki to find that out. Like, what? No, just say it's an item for such and such covenant. That's not that fucking hard, man. Ugh. And honestly, it's shit like that all the way down, Um, there's a ton of items in the game that seem to have a straightforward purpose, but the item description would not lead you to believe that at all, because it's just flowery Shakespearean nonsense about blood and dreams and blood and nightmares and more blood and spinal fluid and aliens and like, Jesus fucking Christ, man. Have your flavor text, but also have a description of what the item actually fucking does, please. Like every other game in the series, please. You fucking crazy bastards. So, that. Also, Bloodborne has a weird twist on the teleportation mechanic. I mentioned this a little bit in my last video, but like Demon's Souls, instead of teleporting directly from between locations, you teleport from wherever you are in the world to your hub area, the Hunter's Dream, and then you teleport from that hub area to wherever you want to go. And that sucks. Like, it really sucks. For one thing, the load screens are stupid long. Even after all the patches they did to make the load screens much shorter, they're still too long. And actually, when I first played the game, you don't actually have to download the patches before you play the game. So when I first got the game and started playing it, I didn't realize that the updates hadn't been installed, and I just started playing. And the original load screens were just the logo of the game for like 3 minutes as the game loads a new area. And I do actually mean 3 minutes every single time you die or warp anywhere. And you can't warp directly point to point. So that's 2 load screens whenever you want to travel to a new place. It's insane and unacceptable, and god damn it, FromSoft, how fucking dare you. Now, with the updates, the load screens are not that long. They're, closer to like 30 seconds, which is still far too long, honestly. I mean, it's insultingly long. And you get used to it as you play, but you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to. Because those load times are longer than Demon's Souls on the PS3. And they're longer than Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 on my PC. So, yeah. Unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. I know that might not matter to some people, but it does matter to me. And look, I get it. I am, a good game can have horribly long load times. I don't hate Borderlands 1 because of its load times. But actually, Borderlands 1 got an enhanced update for anyone who had the Game of the Year version, and it was a free update. And I think the load times on that one are much shorter, but seriously, I'm no stranger to games with long load times, and I'm perfectly fine playing them, but Bloodborne is insultingly long with its load times, and it's just ridiculous that they ever got away with that. I suppose I should mention here that the online multiplayer for Bloodborne basically doesn't exist. I mean, online multiplayer for the Souls games is a little bit all over the place to begin with, and I personally am not one of the people who goes to the Souls games for its online features. You know, I occasionally like to do cooperative play, and I've participated in a handful of duels and invasions, just because. But ultimately, I think those things are ancillary and unnecessary to the core experience. However, it's worth noting that you kind of can't even count those as part of the experience in Bloodborne, because in order to connect to the online, you need to be, you need to pay for the PlayStation Network. And so, yeah, I'm not spending however much that is. I just won't. Sorry. And, most of the people who play the game, it's a console exclusive, and most of the people who play the game probably aren't the kinds of people who play tons of multiplayer games on their console, because who the fuck plays multiplayer games on their console? And, paying extra money to get access to the online features is not super interesting to most people. And because of that, the online community is, going to be much smaller than any of the other games where online access is free. And because of that, it's even less appealing, creating a negative feedback, or a positive feedback loop in a negative direction. And, and because of that, I can't really comment on the online aspects except to say that everyone I've asked in the community thinks that the online in Bloodborne is more dead than any other game. Yeah. Each of the games has their own following for online, and they're actually pretty active overall. Most of the people who play Dark Souls 1 will play the Prepare to Die edition rather than the remaster, because the remaster is shit and not worth your money. Most of the people who play Dark Souls 2 will play Scholar, because I guess it has better visuals, but honestly, I don't care. I just don't like the fact that it's essentially just a randomizer on the base game. Nah, I don't need that dragon in the first level. I don't need pursuers around every fucking corner in the prison. I don't need that shit. There's no fucking reason for it. It's nonsensical. Maybe it's fun to have a randomizer for a game that you've been used to for a long time, but I'm just not into it. But it does boast, higher numbers on the pixel count and such. Not that I give a shit about that, but it does. And for Bloodborne, there's just no multiplayer. There might be a little bit, but it's relatively dead because the PlayStation Network and time and the fact that there's no replayability in the game. Just, yeah. Now, admittedly, if you're doing player versus player, some of the weapons might be more interesting in terms of, being able to trip people up because they don't know how to respond to it and things like that. But, they won't be as good as the Saw Cleaver in terms of PvE, and yeah. So, yeah, honestly, all of that combined makes Bloodborne feel like a stripped down version of what the other games do, and not in a good way, because some could argue that, oh, well, they've taken on all these elements to streamline the experience and really focus on these one or two things, and I don't think they did. I think they just took all that shit out because it was too much work, and they were on a deadline, and they were working for Sony, and they didn't really give too much of a shit, and they just kind of wanted to push something out there. And yeah, um, you know, also, as mentioned in previous reviews, Bloodborne has a very interconnected world. There's only like 2 or 3 areas that are not traversable through walking from one end of the map to the other, and there's really no reason for it to have a hub world, you know? Like, even those new areas have teleportation spots built into the map, so you can walk from one end of the map to the other. You'll just hit a load screen at some point. But again, like, you know, the fact that you can do that means, why is there a hub world? Why are there, 5 headstones to divide up the lanterns you can warp to when they aren't unique areas? Except for the Nightmare of Mensis or whatever, all of the areas are directly connected by land to each other. That's the only area where you need to, really teleport. That and the ice level. And now, true, that Nightmare area has 2 sections. So you teleport into, well, actually 3 sections. So you teleport into the base area, and then from there are 2 different places you can teleport out to, and each of them have their own bosses and shit. But, like, again, there's no reason you need a hub for that, right? Like, they're fairly interconnected. And we know for a fact that there is an area exactly like the Hunter's Dream built into the game as a physical area you can travel to and from, and yet you still need a hub world where you warp back and forth. And I don't know why, I don't know why the Hemlock Grove is on a separate headstone from Yharnam, because you can literally walk between them. You do walk between them in order to unlock Hemlock Grove. Like, why is that a thing? I mean, again, the DLC is a different beast. It's off in its own corner doing its own thing. But I feel no reason for there to be a hub area, and it feels lazy and cheap. And I really would have liked the game a whole hell of a lot more if the lanterns just worked like the bonfires from Dark Souls 1. I mean, Dark Souls 1 still kind of has a hub in Firelink, but, you don't have to warp to Firelink if you don't want to, And, I mean, honestly, same thing in Dark Souls 2. You need to go to Majula to level up, but other than that, you can warp point to point if you're just out gathering shit or farming or, traveling or whatever, and you don't want to stop to level up yet. Of course, the fact that you can't level up at bonfires and instead need to go talk to the Herald makes it more annoying to do that, because you want to level up most of the time. But technically you don't have to if you don't want to. And I think that with a world this rich and interconnected, it would have been much better to use the system of bonfires from Dark Souls 1, because, then you can focus on exploring this rich interconnected world. And honestly, I feel like the load screens and the, having to teleport back and forth twice and talk to the NPC to level up and all that shit is because they wanted to artificially extend the length of the game because the game is very short without the chalice dungeons, um, you know, and the DLC, which costs $20 to this day. Even if you buy a physical copy of the game, you don't just automatically get the DLC. You have to buy it separate, and which is kind of fucked up because the Prepare to Die edition of Dark Souls 1 comes with the DLC. Dark Souls 2, I believe, comes with the DLC free now. I know I got it all bundled, and that was a couple of years ago. I'm pretty sure Dark Souls 3 also comes with it all bundled now, under one price tag. But I think there is an option to buy it without the DLC for a slightly lower price tag, but it's not that big of a difference. However, Bloodborne, you had to pay an extra $20. I had to pay an extra $20 this year in 2020 to get the DLC, and that's bullshit. It shouldn't cost that much. I mean, in a way, I guess it's kind of worth it, but not really. Because, like, for $20, you get 3 boss fights and 5 new areas to explore. 5-ish. And one of those boss fights is just a huge clump of regular enemies with nothing else going on. And another one is a hunter that takes place like literally in the next room after that fight, and doesn't have its own level or anything attached to it. There also aren't a whole lot of new enemies in these areas. There's a couple, but mostly it's stuff you've already been fighting for the entire game up until this point. So it's, value-wise, I'm just not sure that it's worth it, honestly. But it's okay, I guess. But honestly, even comparing all the games, comparing the final count of bosses and stuff, Bloodborne has a lot of hidden bosses and boss-esque fights. And there are some bosses that aren't even accessible outside of the Chalice dungeons, which is surprising, but I have a whole video where I talk about the Chalice dungeons. But realistically, if you compare the constructed content of the games, Bloodborne is significantly shorter than any of the other games, except maybe Demon's Souls. And that shouldn't be the case, Going through Bloodborne feels like, like I'm just being bull rushed along through the talking points and not really getting to see anything because there's nothing to see, It's really small. Now, the Chalice dungeons do extend that. Like I mentioned in my video about that, they're significantly longer than I expected them to be. And honestly, they're probably as long as some of the other headstones. Like, seriously, going from the top of Femora or whatever down to the very bottom of it is just insanely long. But it's also not constructed content, it's randomized. It's randomized within parameters, rather. And it's very clear that some of the encounters are designed to be encounters because of the way they repeat, and some of them are just thrown together because of how they don't repeat. But honestly, I would have loved the Chalice Dungeons a lot more if you just took that content out of where it is and put it into the constructed part of the game. Like, why is it in this randomly generated area? Why is there a randomly generated area? What is the point of that? You know? Again, it feels like padding. Like, oh, our game is too small and we don't want to add a bunch of new constructed stuff, so let's add a secondary section where people can run through randomly generated stuff as long as they want. And, you know, it honestly feels like there are only maybe 20 different rooms in the entire Chalice dungeon setup, and some of them are programmed to show up all the freaking time. Some of them I saw literally, 6 or 7 times per chalice. Some of them more than that, and some of them I only saw like 3 times in the entire game that I went through. And, I just wish that a little bit more care or effort had been put into this so that these areas had been able to be more, interesting and developed. If you had each of these areas, instead of being randomly generated, you had them as, here's the tombstone that takes you to Flormaru, and here's the tombstone that takes you to the second place, and here's the tombstone that takes you to the third place. And yeah, I can't remember what any of them are called because I don't care. But if you had those 4 distinct areas and they were distinct and they were, even keeping them cut off from the rest of the game, I still think they would be much more interesting if they were carefully crafted content rather than randomly generated content. There are some bosses, as I mentioned, that are only in the Chalice dungeons, and some of them are quite good, but it's just kind of impossible to really evaluate the game as a whole without talking about them. And I really feel like they're just there to pad out the game, and so that when someone says, man, this game's really short, someone else will jump to FromSoft's defense and say, oh, but what about the Chalice dungeons? Did you do those 100 times each? Because you can, and it's technically unique each time, even though it doesn't feel that way. Like, honestly, I just went through the 6 headstones, and I felt like I was repeating myself very quickly. And, by the time I got through the last headstone, I was just like, oh, Jesus fucking thank God I'm finally through this shit and I never have to look at these fucking chalices again. I swear to Christ, if I see that one room with the fucking 3-way entrance shit again, I'm gonna fucking kill somebody. For anyone who doesn't know, there's this one room in the Chalice dungeon where it's like 2 levels and it always has 3 doors attached to it, and there's a ladder and a bridge, and it shows up like 4 times in each level of each chalice. It's insane how frequently that room is repeated, and I hate it. So yeah, all in all, I don't think the chalices were a good addition because it just makes me, crave for what could have been and kind of hate the game for not living up to that height that I know they could reach because they've done it. Like seriously, think about it this way. The Chalice dungeons are like what they did with the Nightmare of Mensis, but cut into 100 little pieces and randomized. And the difference, because like that is an area that's disconnected from the rest of the game, has its own theme, does its own thing, has its own lore, but But the difference, obviously, is that the chalice dungeons take a lot less effort to make because they're randomly generated, and you know, you don't have to put as much into it. And I hate that they took that shortcut instead of, you know, giving us 4 more areas that were well constructed, like that nightmare zone, you know? So, yeah. And honestly, that's about all there is to say about Bloodborne. That and the fact that it uses the word blood way too goddamn much. Like, blood vials, blood echoes, blood clots, blood. Like, Jesus fucking Christ, chill. We get it. The game's bloody. Fuck. You know? Beast blood pellets. Like, everything just randomly has the word blood thrown into it for no reason. And I'm like, look, I know you want your game to be rated M, but there are easier ways to do that are less annoying. I mean, that's just a personal issue. It's not really like a significant thing, but I do feel it whenever I go through the game and I'm just like, oh, look, I've got a bloodstone. Put that right next to my blood clots. And, you know, I mean, it just, so much. Like, so many things are named after blood, and there's no reason for it. You know? It's just ridiculous. So, yeah, that. As far as the world's interconnectedness, you know, like if you ignore the whole lantern mechanic, it's actually pretty good. You know, there are definitely some connections that feel a little bullshit. Like, oh, in order to get to a self-care clinic, you have to climb a ladder from the forest. But the forest doesn't feel like it should be anywhere near a self-care clinic, like, by any stretch. You know, you're clearly walking very far away from the clinic in order to get to the forest. It just doesn't feel right. Um, you know, and when you're up in the clinic area, when you're up in Yarnum and you look down, you don't see the forest there. You know, it doesn't feel like it connects at all. So I feel like that could have been done better. You know, in Dark Souls 1, they do a really great job of making areas feel interconnected like that, even if they don't necessarily line up as cleanly as you think. In fact, there's this whole really great 2-part video from Illusory Wall talking about that. It's great. Go subscribe to his channel, watch that video. You know, very fascinating stuff. But I never got the feeling of interconnectedness from Bloodborne that I got from Dark Souls 1. And aside from the ladder into a Sofka's clinic, there's nothing immersion breaking about Bloodborne and its layout, but it just doesn't feel that clean, you know? Like I said, you can run from one end to the other without warping most of the time, and that's pretty cool. I really appreciate that. But I don't know. I just feel like there's not really a point to that when you still have the hub area. And again, the game lacks replayability. Like, the environments are cool and the bosses are cool, but I'm not gonna go through Bloodborne and challenge myself to only use the cane or the axe or whatever, because I don't care. You know? Like, I played through it once, like 5 months ago when I first got the game, and maybe a little longer than that. And I played through it once, like a couple of days ago, And I probably won't pick it up for another year or two until I finally am like, you know, can't remember most of the game and I'm like, oh, maybe I should go back and give that another shot. Because quite frankly, it's just not that interesting. Like, I've started a bunch of other characters with other weapons and tried to play through, and it's just kind of shit, you know? Like, I started playing with the cane, and it took me like 6 hours just to get past fucking, what's his face? The first boss? Not Cleric Beast, but the other one. And, and then I started a new character and went through with the saw cleaver and went up to that same point. It took me like 30 minutes. And, you know, and I had also killed Cleric Beast during that time. And I'm just like, yeah, I'll just stick with this character and use the saw cleaver because clearly that weapon is shit, you know? So, yeah, I mean, I like doing challenge runs in these games. You know, I've beaten Dark Souls at level 1. I've got a bow only build in Dark Souls 1 right now. You know, like I said, on my live streaming, I'm doing runs with starting equipment from each of the games, starting with Dark Souls 1 and then branching out to the others. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think that Bloodborne has anywhere near the amount of replayability that any of the other games have. And I don't know, I just don't care for it as much. I mean, you know, the whole Call of Cthulhu meets medieval London meets, you know, giant heaps of blood everywhere isn't inherently bad, but it's not enough to prop up the game when the gameplay isn't as good, you know? It's not as diverse, it's not as interesting, it's not as balanced. And, you know, the game world is smaller and the bosses aren't as interesting. You know, most of them are either normal looking people or people who've gone werewolf and jump around a whole bunch. Sometimes they do the transformation halfway through the fight and then start jumping around and you know, like that's not very visually interesting and it's not very mechanically interesting. You know, because the answer to that is just spam R1, you know? Maybe equip fire first. Spells are kind of whatever. Guns aren't a reliable source of damage. I mean, they can deal some damage, especially against weaker enemies, but it's not your main way of killing enemies by any stretch. And, you know, there's just not a whole lot to do beyond picking up the same weapon and going up against the same enemies. And, maybe if you're a speedrunner, that's great, but I'm not, so I don't care. You know? Yeah. Yeah, that's my take on it. Bloodborne is decent, but doesn't reach the heights of previous titles, and honestly, it feels like it stripped out a lot of the core features that made those titles worth playing in the first place. And it's small. So, yeah, overall, not super impressed with Bloodborne. I don't hate it. It's still got a satisfying gameplay loop for the most part, but I don't know. It just doesn't grab me the way a lot of the other games do. So, yeah, that's Bloodborne for you. Let me know how you feel about it in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next life. Laters. Okay, end card time. I'm supposed to tell you to like, comment, subscribe, you know, all that stupid YouTube shit. There's a bell thingy, whatever. I have all the social media stuff. Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, YouTube. Mostly I use Facebook and Twitter to tell you about my Twitch and YouTube uploads. I've got a Patreon, but Patreon is one of those things where people who can afford to throw away money give money to people who can't. And so if you can't afford to throw away money, then you shouldn't be doing that. And if you can afford to throw away money, consider charities. There's a pandemic, there's global warming, there's millions of people in the world who don't have toilets, which is just awful. So I've linked a few charities in the description down below in case you're interested in that. And if you can't donate money to a charity, consider donating some of your time, because that's also very useful. And yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.